Soon after publishing their Census Working Paper 15 in 1963, introducing a socioeconomic status index of occupations based on census data, Charles Namm's census colleague, Ed Stockwell, left the Bureau. Mary Powers, who had finished her PhD at Brown University in 1963, started work at the Census Bureau at about the same time.
Well, Mary Powers was my assistant at the Census Bureau following Ed Stockwell. And after the original occupational index was developed, she and I worked jointly on analyzing data using the index.
She immediately became interested in Namm's work, and the two of them collaborated on further development of the socioeconomic index of occupations.
I was there for a few years. It was very interesting, especially working with Charlie in our little branch of the population division. Of course, we were located in one of the old buildings which had been used as a barracks apparently during World War II. So it wasn't exactly comfortable. There was no air conditioning, and Washington, as you know, gets very warm, among other things. So the building itself was not always the most comfortable place to be in the Washington summers.
After he left Census for Florida State University, Namm continued to correspond and work with Powers.
Well, she left the Bureau and went to Fordham University, where she had a very great career, but we stayed in touch during that time.
Long before the internet or personal computers or email, the long-distance collaboration between Powers and Namm in those days relied on the postal service and telephone conversations.
Actually, however, both Charlie and I were active in the Population Association of America and went to the annual meetings, and the American Sociological Association, the population section of the American Sociological Association. So we generally did meet at the meetings, and were usually able to sit down over dinner or something and discuss some of the current issues with measuring status.
Their collaboration came to focus on an important feature of what became known as the Namm-Powers Index, the fact that status, as measured by this index, is inherently relational and relative, not an absolute characteristic of any isolated individual in the labor force. While measures like age or weight can and should be defined in absolute terms, like years or pounds or kilograms, the whole idea of socioeconomic status refers to the position of an individual in comparison with other people. The index value for any particular worker or occupational group, always between 0 and 100, estimates the percentage of all workers in the labor force who have lower scores. A higher index value means you're ahead of more people, while a lower index value means there are more people ahead of you. That is the essence of it. Even if the education, income, and occupation of an individual all remain the same over time, if more people begin to get higher educations and incomes than that person's status or position compared to others could decline in relative terms. Socioeconomic status is like running in a marathon. The entire crowd of runners is always in motion, and your status reflects where you are in that crowd as everyone goes through life together. Thus, when Namm and Powers compared their index scores calculated from the 1950 census to a new set of scores calculated for the 1960 census, they detected changes over time in these scores.
We found a high degree of overall stability in the status patterns of occupations from one period to the next. The relative status levels of a high percentage of occupations were lower in 1960 than in 1950, owing to a general depression of the status structure. This was due to decreasing relative numbers of persons in lower status occupations. and corresponding increasing relative numbers in higher status occupations.
Their article compares scores for the two census dates for hundreds of specific occupations listed in their appendix. Here we consider only the broadest occupational groupings, but this shows the same result that they reported. Index scores for most occupation groups dropped lower by 1960 than the scores for the same occupation groups calculated for 1950. How should we understand such shifts? It is crucial to remember that despite the relative nature of these index values, this is not a zero-sum situation in which a lower score for one occupation automatically means a higher score for some other occupation. The situation is much more complex than that. First of all, the mix of occupations in the labor force could have changed. The NAM-Powers index score for each occupation depends in part on how many workers report that occupation. And even more importantly, how many workers report other occupations with higher or lower index scores. For example, imagine a very simple labor force with only two occupations, managers and laborers, with 4 workers in each group. Half of the laborers finished 8th grade, the other half finished high school. Among managers, half finished high school and the other half finished college. The average education score is 10 for laborers and 14 for managers. Now imagine that one of the laborers leaves the assembly line and gets a job managing a supermarket. The laborers are now a smaller share of the labor force, 3/8 instead of 1/2, and their education score drops to 9.3. The managers are now a larger share of the labor force, 5/8 instead of 1/2, but their education score also drops to 13.6. Thus, occupational shifts could produce results like those found by NAM and Powers. What actually happened to the relative size of different occupation groups over this decade? Illustrated here are occupation shares not only for 1950 and 1960, but extending on to 1970 and 1980 to show that the trends documented by NAM and Powers were the first signs of an extended transformation of the U.S. labor force. We observe declining shares of relatively unskilled laborers, including farm labor, and also of farmers among male householders. On the other end of the scale, shares of male householders in professional and technical jobs expanded rapidly during the third quarter of the 20th century. In the middle of the occupational range, clerical and sales workers, craftsmen, skilled operatives, and service workers all maintained quite stable shares of the total labor force, but the contraction of jobs below them and multiplication of jobs at higher SES levels meant that each of these roughly constant shares of craft and industrial jobs shifted to lower and lower relative positions in the overall hierarchy of socioeconomic status. In addition to this effect of shifting relative shares of workers in different occupations, the NAM-Powers Index also takes into account relative changes in income and educational attainment for the people within each occupational category. The index score includes the median education and income for that occupation relative to other kinds of jobs, particularly for the moving target of dollars of income. The fact that this index considers only the position of a family's income relative to the income of others is a distinct advantage of the method. During the decades considered here, nominal dollar incomes of U.S. families rose exponentially, but inflation meant that the real value purchasing power of a dollar also shrank rapidly. Even after adjusting for these trends in the value of money, real family incomes nearly tripled on average across the labor force. But the NAM-Powers Index for each year only considers how a family's income for that year compared to other families in that year, their relative income position in the crowd of marathon runners in the labor force. This reliance on relative differences in median family income shows considerable stability over time. The higher SES occupations have median incomes above the average, but the examples shown here of professional, technical, and sales occupations all reveal stable levels of advantage when compared to the largest occupational group for male householders, jobs as craftsmen and artisans. This relative median income for professionals actually declines slightly over time. In part, this reflects addition of many new workers counted as professions, already noted for these men. On the other hand, the relative family income position of the lower SES occupational groups actually improved relative to the craft occupations. This improvement, particularly noticeable for farmers, partly reflects a selection of lower income men out of these groups into other jobs. The case of farmers was most dramatic. We already saw that between 1950 and 1980, this occupation lost about 80% of its share in the labor force. Millions of men left farming for other jobs. Those who remained in this occupation by 1980 were a highly selected group with much higher incomes on average. Only the strong survived. The other component of the NAM Powers Index used to refine scores within occupation groups considers the educational attainment of household heads. The mid-20th century witnessed a dramatic expansion of college education. As Charlie Nam and John Folger noted in a 1964 article published in Demography, overall, about 85% of the rise in educational attainment may be attributed to increasing levels within occupations, and only 15% to shifts in the occupational structure. In 1950, the average worker who had graduated from high school but never went on to college still had more years of education than 2/3, 67.1%, of the labor force. By 1980, though, as more and more people went on to college, the average high school graduate with no college experience only had more education than 42.6% of the labor force. More than half of all workers were more educated by then. The high school graduate had dropped back dramatically in the crowd of marathon runners in terms of relative position. This educational inflation affected different occupational groups very unevenly, however. At the high end of the socioeconomic scale, professional and technical jobs always have had high educational entry requirements, and this did not change very much between 1950 and 1980. They were already mostly college graduates even back in 1950 and before. Similarly, occupations at the low end of the socioeconomic scale, such as laborers and service workers, saw little change in educational attainment. It is true that more of the men in these groups did manage to finish high school, but the share going on to college remained negligible. The big change in these decades appeared among white-collar workers in management, clerical, and sales jobs as part of the remarkable expansion of massive corporate business organizations in the mid-20th century. These large formal organizations came to rely more and more on uniform, impersonal markers of achievement, not only for job performance, but also just to qualify for one of these jobs in the first place. And formal schooling, particularly college degrees, moved to center stage as the standard measure of such achievement. All of these changes considered together make it clear why Nam and Powers discovered declining SES index scores for most specific occupations between 1950 and 1960, a trend that continued in later decades. While both education and family income were increasing for most households across the United States, these increases did not occur evenly for different occupational groups. Educational inflation affected mostly white-collar jobs, and relative income positions shifted across occupations in complex ways. For the final calculation of the relative socioeconomic status of each occupation, changing shares of workers in different occupations also contributed to the observed drop in the NAM Powers Index for many kinds of jobs. As they conclude in this article, quote, relatively more persons in the higher status occupations served to depress the scores for many occupations by making many higher status occupations more common, and hence having relatively fewer persons in occupations below them. In 1971, another census veteran, Jacob Siegel, expressed some unhappiness about this feature of the NAM Powers scores, which he described as, quote, the sensitivity of the scores to changes in the socioeconomic variables, as well as to changes in the occupational composition of the labor force, unquote. In his doctoral dissertation, however, NAM student Walter Terry subsequently pointed out that Quote, this is one of the features of the NAM Census Bureau method of occupational status scoring that disturbed Siegel. It may be argued, however, that this is a desirable property, that as occupations become less differentiated socioeconomically one from another, their scores should change to reflect this fact.
Walter Terry was a graduate student in our FSU population program who had very good technical skills. After he finished his PhD, and I was his major professor, he remained in our center as an applied demographer, largely because we could use his technical skills. He was fascinated with our occupational status data and chose to do his dissertation by focusing in more detail on the contributions of education and income to the status scores. Unfortunately, not long after he finished his doctorate, Walt became ill and passed away. And that was a terrible thing for us as well. And you may know that the Southern Demographic Association has created a Walter Terry Award.
After nearly 3/4 of a century, the NAM-Powers-Boyd Index of Socioeconomic Status remains a cornerstone of analysis of the labor force and the families and workers who participate in it.